Are you ready?
Ready.
Blast off.
This is the PowerShell Podcast. PowerShell Podcast. It's all about PowerShell and the PowerShell community. And now, here's your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plaw.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the PowerShell Podcast. I'm one of the hosts, Jordan Hammond, with the other host, Andrew Plaw. The other feels so demeaning. Yeah. Today we have a special guest. It does. You know what? With super special co-host, Supreme, Andrew Plaw.
Thank you. That's deserving. Yeah.
And we brought in a special guest, Mikey Lombardi, who also will bask in Andrew's excellence.
Yeah, it's just radiating right onto me right now. It's pretty great.
Welcome.
All right.
So,
I'm sorry for this episode. No, I'm just, I know we were having a conversation beforehand. We were talking on things like tabletop RPGs that we can't, because it's not really PowerShell, but I'm excited based on those conversations where we're going here.
You know, Jordan, there's a tie-in later. You'll see it is related. So maybe later on we'll tie it in and show you how relevant this is to your lives.
All right.
So, Mikey, man, I think we met back in 2018, if I'm remembering correctly. I think you were at
Summit.
Yep. I definitely
thought you were
that.
a plant from Rob Reynolds. I thought he was messing with me when you greeted me. I was like, nobody recognizes me. This is ridiculous. Oh, I see. He's standing next to Rob. That must be Rob's fault.
Wait,
no.
So he got you in 2018 as well? Well, to be fair, he didn't get me. I was at the airport, and Andrew goes driving by, hanging out the window of the Uber, yelling about how awesome the guy standing next to me was. And we're like, what just happened?
That's rad.
That did happen. But then I met Jordan and it was cool. That was the year we met. I think we met the next year too. Did you come the next year? Or did I just remember you really well since then?
Well, so in 2019, we're trying to cycle through, make sure everyone at the company had a chance. So I got rotated out. So I changed jobs to make sure I could go every year because I'm selfish.
Nice. Yeah, I got to make sure I'm there next year. So yeah, 2018, and you mentioned, yeah, I definitely was enamored by the community in 2018 and 2019, and still to this day. So whenever I got a chance to meet someone who I respected and looked up to, and was striving to be like, because that's what it was for me. Like early on in my PowerShell career, there were a lot of people doing a lot of things in a way that I had never seen before, with an understanding and with access to this information that I wasn't consuming, and to this mindset, like the Phoenix Project, kind of maybe a different way of doing things a little bit. And so, yeah, it was like a magical time. I really enjoyed that part of my PowerShell journey, the first few years of just kind of diving in and all the community support and getting to meet people like you.
Yeah, it was a really cool period of time where it was sort of like a changing of generations, I guess, if generations are like 3 to 4 years long in the PowerShell community, where I was coming up at the same time as Brandon Olin and Chris Hunt and folks like that. And moving in those circles, not really like in tight with people like Don Jones or whatever. There's the next group of people that was coming along and getting to the point where we were doing talks and writing a lot of blog posts and stuff. And so it was a really cool moment, I think. And when you recognized me was when I was like, people notice the stuff I do, because a lot of it you feel like, am I shouting into nothing? Does anybody hear me? So that was really cool and very, very lucky feeling. There's definitely a good feeling to being recognized. You got to be careful to not encourage too much. It's not I'm Italian. I don't have a small ego to begin with, so trying not to encourage the beast.
Makes sense.
I go a different route. If I'm recognized, I just go into absolute imposter syndrome and try to hide.
It's a weird thing. But you kind of mentioned something that I want to get into. You said new generations, kind of people coming up. And yeah, you mentioned some really impactful people, in my opinion, in the community that were kind of coming up with you. But I'm curious about how has that kind of come up in their involvement in community related stuff? How has it affected kind of everyone's career that was going through that? just in general, what does kind of going through that process of showing your expertise, what kind of jobs does it lend itself to, and what type of environments, like supportive or what?
So there's a couple things that happened, I think broadly for people in my group, right? And then Chris Hunt and Brandon and I all had like this kind of similar arc, where we were all doing sort of traditional opsy stuff, and PowerShell was sort of like a rocket ship that takes you. You get to Delta V, right? You escape gravity. And then you rocket off into other stuff. And so we all ended up moving on to maybe some different things. Brandon and Chris stayed closer to ops, but I think they both ended up at Stack Overflow, doing some really cool stuff. I randomly ended up completely changing careers. Right, so I started very, very high level. When I started learning PowerShell, I was in a position as a tier 2 sysadmin, which I had no business being in. Right, that was my first real tech job. I was a terrible intern, and then I lost my internship because it depended on you being a student, and I dropped out. And it turns out they do check that. Like when it's time to re-up your internship, they go, "Hey, you stopped going to class. You can't be a student intern." I was like, "Oh," I was like, "So your job terminates next month?" And I was like, "Oh, I got to pay rent." So I went from there to getting a job as a tier 2 sysadmin. Somebody I met in a class for PowerShell stuff actually was like, "Hey, I know you're looking for work. If you want, you could apply to this one." And I did, and it worked out. And then I got really into PowerShell there. And then people I'd met during my internship were like, "Hey, you're a PowerShell guy, right? Are you looking for a job? Because we really need somebody who does PowerShell." And I was like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Cool. Well, we have a tier 3 sysadmin position open if you want that. But like, you'll be a sysadmin on paper, but really you'll be writing tools for us." And I was like, "I could do that. But also I feel like I'm entirely unqualified." They're like, "Well,
how early on to your career was this though?"
That was 3 years.
Okay.
3 years like professionally in IT. Then I went to tier 3, which is ridiculous. I had no business doing that. And then I was there for all of 6 months when I got a cold call from a recruiter that was like, "Hey, we have a PowerShell developer position open. Would you be interested?" And I said out loud, "That's not a real job." And then answered the email and was like, "Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Let's put in for that." Like, and you mentioned, you asked earlier, like, how does the community involvement stuff help? So I got that cold reach out, and I had just started the St. Louis PowerShell user group maybe 3 or 4 months before, not much longer than that. The speaker that night was the guy leaving the position that I had just been reached out to for. So I asked her in the meet, I was like, "Hey, does anybody know about this company and like a PowerShell developer position? Anybody have any idea what this is?" And it was our speaker, and he goes, "Yeah, that's the one I'm leaving. We'll talk about it afterwards." So then in the parking lot, he gave me like a 2-hour rundown of like, this is where they're at, this is what they need, this is what they're working on, this is what they expect. Here's how much they're paying me, so don't take any less than that. Yada yada yada. And we're like, got really set up with that, and it sounded like a really cool job. He was leaving it because it was contract to hire, and he was like 6 or 8 weeks in, and he just found out that his spouse was pregnant, and he was like, "I kind of need a little more stability than maybe they'll continue my contract." So he was going back to doing some more stable work. Anyway, that worked out for me. I got that gig, and then I met Glenn Sardi at Summit, and Glenn was like, "Hey, you should apply to come work at Puppet." And I said, "I'm not a software engineer." Glenn said, "Well, why don't you let us tell you no?" Which is the recurring theme, right? Like I got the same thing for tier 2 and 3, and it's like, I'm not qualified. I felt like I bombed those interviews. I felt really stupid. They hired me anyway, for good or for ill. And then I stuck at Puppet for a long while. Probably the longest I've been in any position, about 5 years, a little bit less. And now I'm a tech writer at Microsoft. That position came open towards the end of last year, and I was like, I could probably write about PowerShell. I used to do that for fun. I could probably do that professionally. And that worked out too. So a lot of it for me is like community gave me the skills, right? A lot of what I learned from other people, but it also gave me visibility. And when you're looking for roles, one of the hardest things is just having people know you exist. That makes a lot of opportunities come open that otherwise wouldn't. I read a blog post or maybe it was in a book or something in like 2015, 2016 that said that luck is making yourself available for opportunities, right? When you like, they were talking about like people who are considered lucky or people who are in positions to take advantage of opportunities when they come up, right? And a lot of that they found was like, if you help other people, if you are, the type of person who sets other people up, gives them opportunities or whatever, people remember that. And like your name's at the top of that list when they're looking for people. And that's what's happened to me historically. And a lot of that is just luck and privilege. I'm fairly visually memorable. I'm an ogre with a big red beard. It's hard to forget my face. So
I was talking about how I haven't had beard envy in a long time. I don't like this feeling.
It's all right. It's okay. Everybody's beard's different.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, the community thing, I think we've touched on it a few times in episodes where it's like, yeah, you have to put yourself out there. That's the advantage of attending events. Like you attended an event and got to have a conversation with the person who had the role you were applying for. That's a huge advantage. And that is exactly what you meant, putting yourself in an opportunity to have amazing things happen. And, you mentioned how Jordan, how I like greeted you all, and I met you, Jordan, and years and years later, that relationship would sort of end up with me working with you. And you have to put yourself out there, say hello to people, tell them honest things. I find it pretty useful to always be honest. That's a pretty important thing. But if you just take advantage of just giving positive feedback or genuine feedback, or show that you're engaged with something, show what you're learning, whatever steps are comfortable for you next, it's always a good idea to kind of start pushing your limits, because that's where some real growth happens. And you mentioned the skills that the community gave you.
Yep.
Yeah, those kind of come over time. Those are important skills that I'm guessing you take with you into work all the time.
Yeah. It started, we were writing batch scripts to do some stuff when I was in tier 2, and I was like, this is miserable. There's got to be a better way.
Batch scripts.
Yeah, it was rough. That environment was a 2003 domainless setup with Oracle running on Windows. Miserable. I do not recommend either of those things to anybody. But we were trying to work around it, and then I remembered that there's this thing called PowerShell, and so I started seeing if that would work. I forgot about loops until I went on to Reddit. I'd done C++ in college, and I was like, I feel like I'm writing a lot of the same code over and over and over again. Surely there's a way to abstract this. And then they're like, here's how you write a function. That's where I started, right? That's how incompetent I was at the start of this journey, and just sort of picked up stuff there. And the thing that I found, because I haven't, really held the same core job responsibilities twice in a row, right? The stuff that I did in tier 2, I didn't do when I went to tier 3. And the stuff that I did at tier 3, I didn't do when I became a PowerShell developer. It was really more of an automation engineering role. And then I didn't do those things when I went to Puppet as a software engineer. And now I'm not doing any of those things as a tech writer. But the skills and knowledge that you pick up along the way is so cross-applicable, right? Learning how to deal with incoming ops tickets, right? There's a lot of that actually applies to software development tickets, right? In terms of what are the things that annoy you when you get an ops ticket? Right? The service is broken. What service? Broken how? What do you mean? So as a software engineer, it was if I have to file an issue for somebody else upstream, I need to be very explicit and say, this is what I was trying. this is what I expected. This is how it did work. This is how I think it should have worked. Here's, where my investigation led me as far as I could take it. I'm not the expert on this. I'm handing it off to you. Those tickets get solved so much faster than, module foo doesn't work. It's like, well, what do I do with that? That's nothing. And then similarly, like now that I'm doing documentation, when I'm writing the docs, it's like, I have to think about how, ignorant me in 2012 would have approached this. What would I have tried, not knowing all the stuff that I know now, all the advanced bits? What would I have tried and how would that have hurt? And then making sure that I document it in such a way as to like pull you away from the pit traps and the bear traps and like lead you to the stuff that's going to work right for you. Like there's a place for you to like really dig in and get all the advanced, like how does this work under the covers and stuff? But like, that's not in a tutorial. I shouldn't sidebar you and be like, oh, and by the way, in case you were curious about scopes, here's everything to know about scopes. It's like, I just wanted to make my variable available. What are you doing? So it's stuff like that. I mean, and it's cross-domain, even outside of tech. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. We talked a little bit earlier about D&D, and that's huge. A lot of cross-domain skills, I think, are really important.
Yeah, I think you did a pretty popular talk at PowerShell Summit that had a big involvement with D&D.
Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons in development was my best received talk, the most fun to write and the most fun to give, and probably the topic I'm most passionate about as I kind of moved into like a senior sort of role. The other ones being like docs as UX is pretty important, and then how you triage your code base, your script base was pretty important. Although I felt like I was doing penance writing that one because I did it at the same time that I was doing the D&D talk, and I was like, I should do something technical so they'll let me talk about something cultural.
So the docs as UX, I feel like you have to give the subtitle to get the full impact. Rightfully writing the right things. That's some genius right there.
That was a lesson from Glenn, was that your title has to be pretty short and clear, and people should kind of like get an idea, and then your subtitle should be something fun to play with. And for me, the fun in that is like at least audio. I just had the word in my head. It's the problem with ADHD is you forget things you were going to say.
Alliteration.
Alliteration. There you go. You got it. So like they don't actually start with the same letters, but.
So
I think we do that for our podcast episodes, don't we?
Sometimes, yeah. So
it's good to do.
You gave that talk in 2018. Did that come up at all when you were applying to write documentation for Microsoft? It feels like there's a pretty direct tie-in there.
Yeah, a little bit when I was talking to Sean, who I now work with full time, and I think part of the reason that I was in for the interview loop, at least, was like I was already on record as saying the sort of things that like tech writers take seriously. And so it's like, so he says the stuff, let's go dig in and see if like, you could back it up, right? Does he mean it? Does he know how to do it? Because it's easy to say like, you should write docs. Anybody could say it. You could teach a toddler to say it. Do they get why? Do they understand how, right? Those are different pieces. So.
I think you're talking about Sean Wheeler.
Yes.
Guest of the podcast. He was on one of our episodes earlier.
I thought I saw, I might be way off base, that he recently changed his role at Microsoft.
Yeah. Sean is now a principal content developer instead of a senior. So huge congrats to him. Unbelievably well deserved. Yeah.
He was the first person to reach out to us to tell us our documentation was wrong, but we appreciate it. It meant we knew that people were listening. It was a big deal for us. It was very exciting.
Sean has been a great mentor. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Steve Lee liked a tweet of yours. So he knows that we did an episode. So that's good too. I love Steve Lee.
Steve's great.
That guy. He's a poker player. Jordan. Jordan is too.
Not anymore.
Head-to-head showdown.
I lost the ability to bluff once I married and had kids. Like the money on the table started to matter more and more, and I could no longer put
Did you
put
giggle
money
when you
in-
did it, or
No, I lost the ability to follow through on a bluff. So it was always just wasted money. It's well, once I got married and had kids, I became a far worse poker player. But it was a worthwhile trade-off.
I haven't played poker since I had the kid. I should try again. See how I do.
You feel different, or at least I did. I don't know, maybe.
I grew up because my dad was a navigator for airplanes. So flight crews often sit alert and have hours and hours of nothing to do, and so they play poker and other card games. So growing up, we played unbelievable amounts of variations of poker and a bunch of other games like Briscola and Scopa and a bunch of other stuff, a lot of Italian card games. And then that's actually how I made side money in college, was hustling poker games. It's very, very fun. Not a thing I ethically endorse for what it's worth now that I'm in my 30s. So maybe don't do that.
if I ever do anything like that, I keep the stakes so low because I don't know. To actually put money in it, I'd have to invest so much time to get good, which I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to get better at PowerShell.
That I can't do. If the stakes are high enough that everybody feels it, you're going to get people playing bad hands just because they don't care. The stakes have to matter so people play their best game.
Yeah, I've tried playing chip poker and it doesn't work because people won't. And maybe it's the same as me, Jordan. It kind of sounds like it's like, no, I like the mental part of the game, like the whole side of it that is around like reading people and figuring out what's going on. Like that's the part for me that's fun. And if people aren't playing it seriously, it's like, well, then why play?
Yeah.
Because I could play a computer at that point, right? And I would get the same experience. So I would rather play for real. But I found like even just like a $10 buy-ins was enough, right? And that would get, at least in college, because $10 is like all your beer money for the next 2 days. Well, I should play seriously enough. But yeah,
I think we're starting to see where you dropped out.
Yeah, you get it. I was a bad student and undiagnosed ADHD and like dealing with all that stuff and not having the language or understanding of like what was going on. And I felt like I was throwing money down the drain. And so I was like, I'm out. I quit. Shouldn't have done that when my rent depended on me being in school, but whatever, it worked out. I'm fine now.
When they brought you back around after letting you intern, did you come back in like Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman? Just like, big mistake. Huge.
You goofed. No, it worked out for everybody. Because the tier 3 that I came into were like the really cool tech people that were like around when I was doing my internship that I was like super impressed by. So it was actually like a really cool experience to come back around and have them like asking me questions about my PowerShell expertise and like looking to me for help. Like, cause there was stuff that I was terrible at. Like, if you'd asked me to optimize anything to do with the VMware cluster, I'd have been like, okay, I'm going to Google it. I hope that's right. But that was the point at which like I showed up and I was at the top of my game in terms of like scripting compared to everybody else, right? Because that was like the niche I found. And then when I went to my next gig, it was the same thing. I was the number one person there in terms of like writing good scripts. But then I went to Puppet, and everybody was better than me at everything that we were doing. And it was the first time that I was like, the least competent person in the room. And I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but for me, that was one of the best professional experiences of my life. I power leveled so fast and so far working with Glenn and James and Bill and Ethan and Eric. The code reviews and stuff when I first became a software engineer, they were brutal. I felt so stupid all the time. It's like, that's not how you do this, don't do that. But they changed how I write Git commits. They changed how I structure PRs. They changed how I approach writing code, how I approach documenting code. There was all of this stuff that I had previously thought I was pretty good at. And then I realized like, well, yeah, when you're splashing around in a kiddie pool, it's easy to feel like the biggest person in the kiddie pool. And then you get into the Olympic pool with the actual swimmers and you're like, oh, I'm bad at this. But, the team teaches you because they have a vested interest in like they saw potential and capability in me, and really honed that in. And that was a great experience. And I'm going through the same thing again, which is why I love this job so much. Working with Sean, like I thought I was a pretty good writer, you know. I've been doing it for a while, and I write RPGs on the side. So like I'm not unfamiliar with writing, and you know, my entire academic career, it's a pretty good writer, you know, no problems there. But like a lot of the PRs I've put up, Sean has just like shredded, and he does it in a way, and it was the same thing. This is, I think, an important skill, and I know I'm talking for a long time, but I think a really important skill, something that for me denotes like whether this person is good at being a senior, is can you give direct, actionable, clear feedback on how somebody is making mistakes or doing something that isn't as good as it could and should be, without being cruel. Because saying like, you know, this sentence construction doesn't work, this doesn't flow, you're not, you know, ordering this stuff in a way that makes sense for, you know, readers. Going through all of that, it is very bruising to the ego if you let it be, but it's also a huge gift, right? People who don't care about you or your work won't tell you usefully how it's not working. They'll just say you suck, right? Everybody's seen that like in comment threads on Twitter and Reddit and whatever. It's like, you're an idiot and you don't get this. And it's like, that's not helpful. Thanks, I guess. You know, enjoy being the type of person who does that online, I guess. But getting direct, actionable feedback is one of the best gifts you can get. And I've been unbelievably lucky in my career, especially the last 5 or 6 years, to get that.
The talk that Sean and Mike Robbins did together was basically a plea to the community to submit documentation. But it sounds like if you're interested in writing at all, that's a great way to get a crash course from like the people that are really good at it.
And it echoes something that our previous guest, Chris Bergmeister, talked about. And part of his kind of journey in learning was submitting PRs to the PowerShell repo and getting the PR from someone at Microsoft. You know, for him, that was his opportunity to kind of get that feedback and really incorporate it. And that seems to echo what you're saying about like, if you can open your mind to it and kind of accept that there's going to be a little bit of hurt feelings potentially, you know, look aside from that, take the feedback, you can massively level up.
Yeah. Something that we talk about in RPGs a lot is if you are going to be in a creative field, and fundamentally scripting is a creative field, right? People don't think of it that way, but writing code, writing scripts, these are creative actions. You are generating a reality that did not exist before you started, right? That's the whole point. If you are in a creative field, you have to develop a skin thick enough to receive good faith criticism, right? I'm not saying that you have to be able to just shrug off people being assholes on the internet. That's hard. And you shouldn't have to do that. People shouldn't be assholes, right? Like that's their problem. So the thing that I always tell people is like, first evaluate, is this feedback in good faith? If it's not in good faith, chuck it out. You don't need to listen to it. It doesn't matter, right? But be honest with yourself when you're reviewing whether or not something is good faith. And then look at what they're actually saying and think about how that applies to what you did. That is an entire skill set that you need to cultivate, not just for, you know, writing code, but also for the rest of your career. If you are lucky, you will find a mentor or a peer who will give you the gift of being like, hey, when we were in that meeting and we were trying to pitch our project to the CTO, you were making some pretty bad mistakes that are the sort of thing that we had to rescue. And here's how you could avoid doing that in the future, right? That kind of feedback, when you get that, that's a gift. I say that a lot, but it's true. And if you don't get that feedback, how do you know to do better? How do you improve, right? Exactly. It is so much harder to figure that out on your own. It's like, oh, this is how I made a mistake, than it is to have somebody explain it to you, to show you with a kind of explicit, actionable bit of feedback how you screwed up and how you can do it better. So it cuts out, like, if you think about learning to give a good talk, if you just do that by giving talks and never getting feedback and just trying to like think about how you did, that'll take forever. You could do it. People have done it, but it's long and it's slow and it's hard. And it means you have to fail publicly over and over and over and over and over again. Whereas if you get that good actionable feedback from somebody, you can cut out a lot of those steps and then keep going. So I don't know. It's something I think about a lot.
Yeah. And I think that having a nice work culture where it's safe to assume good intent, you know, and that whole thing where you're open to feedback and there's someone to give you the feedback and you can have these conversations that are often not had. To me, that is a very, very, I don't know if sacred's the right word, but a very, very special opportunity. And, you know, I don't know how often that type of thing happens in outside of our career type stuff. But it is such a fortunate thing because, like you're saying, if you don't get that kind of feedback, you can just go in the wrong direction for a really long time, be trying your hardest, but not trying in the right way, just kind of spinning your wheels. Whereas if you can kind of learn to integrate feedback, accept the reality that you're not perfect now, and there's a lot of things to work on, and there will always be things to work on, you're going to find yourself going in the right direction.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's taking that DevOps principle to heart for yourself, right? You know, the whole iterate, don't increment. It's like if you're trying to grow your skills by incrementalism, that's going to be slower and less effective than iterating on your skill set. Try it, see how it goes, get the feedback, you know, recalibrate, do it again, recalibrate, do it again, and grow that way. I mean, you can do that alongside like incremental learning. It's like, I don't know how to do, you know, conference talks. I've never given a conference talk. Give a lightning talk, right? Get feedback. Find someone you trust to give you some feedback. And a lot of times, if you reach out to people that you've had some sort of conversation with, cold emailing people doesn't really work as well. But if like, you know, you'd have a conversation with somebody before, reach out and be like, hey, would you mind telling me what you think about this talk? Like, honestly, like, I don't want just praise, but like, where do you think I made mistakes? What do you think I didn't do well? If you find somebody whose opinion you trust like that and you seek feedback, people will often give it. And that can be really valuable. And then in turn, that also changes the way people look at you. If you are open to feedback, people want to work with you more, right? If they see that you're trying to improve yourself, people want to work with you more because like, I don't know if it's been the same experience for you, but when I'm sitting on the hiring side of the screen, I don't care nearly as much about what you already know. I care about the way that you approach work. Are you the type of person who hits a hard problem and goes, it's hard, I give up, right? You know, whatever, I'll make this someone else's problem. Or do you hit the hard problem, give it a shot, and then go to somebody else and say, hey, look, this is where I got to. I don't understand how to get further. Could you help me? Do you know when to send up a signal flare? Do you know how to research? Did you put in effort before you sent up a signal flare? Because that also sucks, right? This person's like, I don't know how this works. Can you help? And it's like, what have you tried? Well, I don't even know where to start. Sometimes that's okay, but if that's your pattern, that sucks. So there's a lot of that. And these are like intangible things that like you can't fit on a resume. It's like asks good questions. Like, well, what does that mean?
I would say even if they weren't sure where to start, they could still show that they've put in effort to try to figure out where to start and they just were missing it. I think that would be acceptable.
There have been so many times when I was doing technical interviews and they ask me questions I don't know the answer for. And what I do is I say, well, I don't know. So here's how I would start trying to figure that out. And, you know, if these 6 or 7 steps of like research didn't point me in the right direction to try something, I would grab a team member and I would, you know, say what I had looked into and yada, yada. And I found for me, that has always worked better. And I've had a couple of times interviewers have been like, hey, you know, we asked you a couple questions you didn't know the answer to, and you told us how you'd look into it. That was really cool. We really appreciated that about the interview. That was one of the things that you were really strong on. Because sometimes people just try to make it up on the spot, and that sucks. So I think that's like a good thing I think people should take with them is like, know how to research a problem. And if you don't know in an interview, it's okay to say, I don't know. Here's how I would try to figure it out.
I've never graded I don't know negatively during an interview. because no one knows everything and the honesty is important.
100%. Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned iterating on your growth, and if you want to do a talk, do a lightning talk. What was your journey in? What were the steps that you took? What was the first little small step? What was the next one? Were there any huge jumps you took?
For speaking, or for just
general generally? Community involvement, like maybe your first blog post, the first time you felt comfortable. I don't know. Whatever was a struggle for you.
So it started on Reddit initially, was asking questions. And then when somebody else asked a question and I was like, I think I might know the answer to this, I gave it a shot. I was like, here's what I think it is. Sometimes I was right. Sometimes I was right, but not right enough. And then somebody would come across and be like, well, actually, there's a little bit of nuance there. And I heard that people were on Twitter for the PowerShell community, and there was that was growing. That was around 2016, I think, was when I heard about that. And so I was like, oh, maybe I should get on Twitter. And I did. And I initially only followed PowerShell people and kind of started getting involved there, asking and answering questions. And then we didn't have a St. Louis user group, and it didn't seem like anybody was just going to spin one up on their own. So I said, well, how hard could it be? The answer is very hard. It can be a lot of work. But I was pretty dumb and didn't know. And I figured if it doesn't work out, I'll just silently kill it and who will notice. So did that.
Talking about my life over here.
I mean, a lot of it, a lot of my growth came from small moments of finding the courage to kind of get over imposter syndrome and just do it. Especially early on, I do think it requires some amount of courage, not physical for sure, but it is genuinely scary to try something brand new that you're pretty confident you have a good shot at failing at, right? But as I kind of alluded to earlier, failure is not the end, right? There's a great song by a band called Listener that says, failing is not just for failures, it's for everyone. Failures just have more experience, which I think is true, and I think important, because it's that experience that helps you grow, right? That's part of being alive, right? No one doesn't make mistakes. So trying it kind of is that first step. And then from there, just being open to the feedback and putting in that continual effort to get somewhere. I think that's really what it comes down to, which is I wish I could give the listeners a silver bullet, here's how you become an expert in 30 days or less. But the truth is you just have to try, and it is work. And it's not always easy, and it's not always fun. It is, if you screw up 5 or 6 or 10 times in a row, that sucks. That's a brutal ego beating. But having the durability inside yourself to get through those moments, to know that you're on a journey and that failure isn't the destination for you, I think is really important. And it just means you're going to have to keep at it, and you'll need luck. I don't want to discount that either. I talked about how my career has gone. That is not a normal career trajectory, right? So much of that comes down to being lucky, being in the right place at the right time and open to those opportunities. And that's I can't give you advice for how to, have the dice roll your way. I don't control that. It'd be cool if I did, but I don't.
Right. So a lot of it was, you even said when you got that opportunity, you didn't feel qualified, but you felt confident you could learn it. I think that's a big one, is you're not going to be a perfect fit for maybe your dream, but you can get there if you can just get your foot in the door.
Yeah. And I was also lucky enough that every time I felt that way, both at Puppet and when I was going to the tier 3 job, especially, I was lucky enough that I had somebody on the other side of the fence who was like, why don't you let us tell you no? Don't tell us no for you, right? Don't say no on our behalf. Let us make the call. You're not privy to all the things that go into our decision process. So don't preemptively close yourself out of these opportunities. Because if I had done that, I would never have gone to those places or done those things. I would never have gotten to where I am now. And I was in real danger of doing that. You know, if they hadn't taken me aside and been like, don't do that. It's like, the world's going to tell you no enough. Don't say no for the world, right? Let the world say it if it's going to. I think that's a really important lesson.
Yeah, I think the other side is, if the worst thing that could happen to you is being told no, that's all right.
Yeah, you'll be fine. You'll be sad for a couple of days, and it'll be something that you don't look back on fondly, probably, but it's not going to kill you.
So you're talking about the St. Louis user group, and the nice thing about almost all user groups is when they have them now, they're available online, so you can join from anywhere. I respect that you got up and running. I attempted, and it was destroying me to the point where people. My parents contacted me from watching a random webcast I'd done saying, "You don't seem right. What's wrong?" And it was just the stress of so I had to give it up. Now I just support Andrews over in Florida, and I'm not hosting anymore, but I'm in a better place, and I still get to be involved a little bit. So that's nice. So I respect you guys up and running, but if if it's one where you're interested but you don't think you're up to that task yet, just join into the existing ones and help out where you can, and see how that works for you to start.
I don't think there's any user group that isn't looking for help, right? It is enormous work. The reason that I gave it up, so I let the St. Louis one go dark when COVID happened. We didn't have a physical place to meet, and I was on the brink of having a baby, so I was like, I don't have the time and interest, and I've tried to get other people to like pick up the ball and run with it, and no one will, so I'm just going to let it go dark because I can't do it. And I would rather not do it than fumble the ball continuously and annoy everybody. And that's been fine. But, one of the biggest things, I think one of the things that makes the Research Triangle group so successful is that they have distributed the work across more than one person. Running something alone is next to impossible. Like if you're successful, the scale of your problem grows, right? Organizing an event where like you're the only one speaking week after week after week, pretty easy. You can schedule you. Getting a speaker lineup and like managing that, or like locations or any of that stuff is tough, which you guys know because you're doing a podcast. It's not easy. So I don't know. It's just like help people.
Yeah, for me, it's easy. I just say, go get him, Andrew, and then I sit back and get benefit.
Yeah. So, you're talking about the challenges of like running a user group and stuff, and I'm just sitting here thinking like, yeah, I'm waiting on an email back from the event place that we're supposed to rent, and oh yeah, we need to guest next week, and oh man.
Yeah, so the Salt Lake City one, pre-COVID, I started up with my mentor, who was a very outgoing person. He could handle all of the socialization. I just had to do things, and I was comfortable with that. And then it went dark same time around COVID. We tried going online, and it just slowly died out. So this time I was like, well, I'm going to bring it back. And he wasn't there this time, and I had to do the social side of things. And I crumbled. Like, it's not easy. For everyone that's out there doing it, you get a lot of respect from me because I've seen what goes into it. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's tough. Putting on events is not easy. Organizing stuff. And this is something like I talk about sometimes is like there's a little bit of hubris, I think, in tech. It's like, well, I do really hard things every day. How hard could this completely different domain be? And it's like, oh, it's pretty hard. It's an entire career field, right? Like group organization and event management is an entire field where people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to experts to like do it for them. And it's like, yeah, it's pretty tough.
Part of me thinks James Petty's going to listen to this episode, just like, you guys don't even approach me right now. I think about with just meetups goes into that. Summit? Boy, I can't even wrap my head around the logistics to get started on that. That's a lot.
It's a whole thing. It's an
enormous undertaking. Yeah. Because you're on that. You're on the group that helps organize that too, right, Andrew?
Yeah, I am. Not for the PowerShell Summit, but for the Automation Summit. It's the same group technically in Slack. Yeah.
Yeah.
So earlier we were mentioning something really important, I feel, which is you touched on imposter syndrome, because that's what it was like for me too at times. Like it was 1,000,000% just me against imposter syndrome. I remember I wrote a chapter in like the PowerShell conference book 2. The deadline was coming up. I was procrastinating. I was struggling so hard, but I knew that it was just, we're just going to go through it. It'll go through the editorial process. It'll be all right. I mean, it brought me to tears from the stress and like just the pressure of it all at the time. But afterwards, when you go through something like that and you kind of break down that barrier for another time and you see yourself through it, and hey, I'm still alive and safe. That's how you can kind of, I don't want to say get over imposter syndrome, but like you can really foster and give yourself the counter experiences of like, hey, I have had a lot of success with taking risks and learning from the experience, learning from the mistakes, and kind of instead of being like a little bit afraid and assuming failure kind of thing.
One of the things that I think is really important to recognize in ourselves is that imposter syndrome comes from a healthy impulse, right? It is a healthy impulse that goes too far. But that healthy impulse is, I want to do my best, and I am engaging in a field or with people who I perceive to be so much further ahead of me. And so where that becomes unhealthy is when it stops you from doing things, or it causes you to freeze. The healthy part of that is that you take it seriously and you give it a shot. And the other thing that I think is useful to recognize is that everybody that you think is so much further than you is experiencing that same impulse for other stuff, right? At the time that we met, I had just gone to Puppet. Right? I had never felt stupider in my whole life than when I had just taken that role. Because I took that role in September, so I was like 6 or 8 months in, and I was just getting to the point where I was starting to like figure out how to write really bad Ruby, but in a way that didn't make my coworkers tell me to rewrite the whole thing, which is good. But like, the imposter syndrome that you were feeling that year, I had for different stuff, but I still had, right? It was like, I still didn't feel like I was a software engineer at that point. I felt like I was wearing somebody else's clothes and showing up to work every day. And the truth is like, when you're working with people and you're worried that you don't fit in or that you're not qualified or whatever, it's like, you're in the door. That's it, right? You're there now. It's like you can feel unqualified or whatever. But the truth is that the people who were already experts in that brought you in. They saw in you, if not the existing capabilities, then the you that will grow into that. And you have to trust in that when you take those roles and take those steps. So I think like one of the things that helped defray imposter syndrome for me was talking to coworkers who I perceive to be so far ahead of me. Like James Pogren is one of the smartest people I've ever met, an incredibly talented engineer, a really, really nice guy, and a good mentor. But he had imposter syndrome for stuff too, right? Like here's this guy that I thought was on top of a cliff towering way over me. And he's like, look, here's the stuff that I'm concerned about. And it was like, oh, so this never really changes? And I was like, well, I mean, yeah, just to different stuff. But yeah, you'll carry that with you forever. That's part of the learning curve, right? If you're feeling that, it means you're growing.
Yep. I like to just remind myself, I don't want to have too much confidence in myself based on my perception. I like having my confidence kind of based on my confidence in humans and just humans' ability to learn and do things. It's not all dependent on your IQ, like just humans fundamentally, if you're at a certain level, you can do really amazing things if you give yourself time and kind of approach things the right way. And we're all human.
That has never been clearer to me than raising a toddler. Right. One of the things that we talk about in RPGs a lot is sort of the sub-design group that I move within talks a lot about trusting players to be able to do the very human thing, which is play games. There's a design theory that's like, players will play your game wrong, whatever that means, or they won't understand how to like navigate a fictional space unless you give them all these tools that they absolutely need to make everything happen. And it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen the counter argument to this, which is walk by a playground. That's the counter argument. People know intuitively how to play. Humans also know intuitively how to learn, how to pick up on stuff. Like, our brains are heuristic generating machines, and you need to give yourself the space and the grace to grow and learn and play. I think play is a really important part of a creative field like coding, which I don't think we talk about enough.
Yeah, I don't play enough. I feel like PowerShell, sometimes I'm sort of playing with it, but I don't have enough play in my work.
Well, on Discord, when you have VS Code open, it says Andrew Pla is currently playing VS Code. So.
That's true.
That's fair. I do have the little pet thing.
Everyone needs VS Code pets.
Yeah, the novelty is too strong.
So it's a plugin for VS Code where you can spawn different. There's like a clip art, like a Clippy, where you get like a cat, and he'll just go and play on your screen. It's a lot of fun.
I'm gonna have to get this.
Oh, they interact. Oh yeah, this will be like the 5th time it's in the show notes for us. I feel
VS Code pets is mandatory for working experience.
I'm into it.
Awesome. We've covered so much great stuff. This has been lovely. But I have a question about a course that you did that I purchased years ago. How do you pronounce it? PwShop.
PowerShop?
That probably makes more sense. PowerShop.
Sure.
So what's the story behind that?
The story behind that is at the time that I was working on it, there's a lot of PowerShell 101 content organized around making you good at PowerShell and making you a good script writer. And all of the focus, at least from the way that it felt to me, was like a long journey towards becoming like a functionally a PowerShell programmer, right? Like that's where they really lead. That's where Month of Lunches is going to take you sooner or later. It doesn't say it on the tin, but that's what's happening, right? And what I was running into when I was at Puppet was I had coworkers who just wanted to get proficient at navigating the shell enough to do the stuff that they needed to do to kind of interact with my team. And so I was like, well, what if I wrote a course that was just like, how do I go from blinking cursor to I understand enough to run these commands and like how this kind of works? How do I navigate the shell as a shell? And so that's why I wrote PowerShop. Was like, look, I'm going to get you through like the stuff that will help you interactively. It's not going to make you by any means an expert, but like, what is a pipeline? What does it mean to have a shell that is object oriented? What are these different streams? I don't understand why like I run a command and I try to capture the output and my verbose logging doesn't show up, right? Those kinds of things. That was what I wanted to address with PowerShop. But I also have had a long interest in instructional design and instructional writing. One of my earliest mentors, Jason Otting, when I was working the tier 2 and tier 3 jobs, Jason had a master's degree in adult instruction. That was like his academic focus, and then he ended up as a guy working in ops. And he and I used to talk for hours. One of the things that I miss the most about an office is going for walk and talks. Just like grabbing a coworker at lunch and being like, hey, let's just go for a walk and chat for whatever, get out of the office and talk. And so he and I used to go for these long walk and talks, and we would talk about how people learn and how people approach things. So I wanted to take some of that stuff and then apply it to PowerShell and see how I did. I very rarely got any feedback on PowerShop. One of the only pieces of feedback I got when I first put it out was Chris Hunt being like, this should be more expensive, which is really nice feedback to receive. It's like, this costs too little money. It's also, right now, it's free. I made it free at the beginning of COVID because I know a lot of people lost their jobs or Their roles became very tenuous, and we're going through another downsizing, I think, across tech right now because the recession stuff. So I'm just leaving it free for anybody who's like, I don't know this stuff, and I think maybe I want to make a career switch. I think it's important that they have good free resources available. So I don't make any money off of it anymore, but I think instructional design is really interesting, and I think that's a very specific learning goal rather than like the more general, I want to get good at PowerShell. So I think that's the niche it still fills.
Did you learn a lot putting it together?
I did. One of the things that I struggled with was writing example exercises that would demonstrate a concept but be cross-platform and be the sort of thing that wasn't going to require you to spin up a bunch of infrastructure or whatever to test, which is really, really hard. That was one of the things that if I had access to a platform that kind of incorporated setting up infrastructure for you, that would have been easier. So I did it with a Vagrant Box and a little bit of command select. There's a little bit of prerequisites. Ideally, you just get a sandbox, which is kind of how Microsoft's training platform works. There was a rebrand recently. So what used to be the docs site is now learn.microsoft.com instead of docs.microsoft.com. And what used to be Microsoft Learn, the interactive content where you like go step by step through modules and learning paths, that's now training. So training gives you a sandbox in Azure where you can go through whatever the training material is, and you have infrastructure set up, and it has a console right there side by side with the learning, so that you can just kind of do it all there, and you don't need to have it installed and available locally because maybe you can't install it on your work computer. I know a lot of people have that problem.
That's super cool. You mentioned instructional design, and then when you look at things like, wait, it's not Microsoft Learn. What did you say it was?
Training.
Microsoft Training. Yeah. When I was playing with it on Microsoft Learn, that stuff is so cool. And when you look at what it represents, to me at least, it's a company who has a vested interest in getting people trained on this technology. So they're going to dedicate a lot of resources and over the years kind of really figure out what is the best way. And that's kind of what I was fascinated by DevOps in general. It's like, oh, these companies are massively incentivized to solve these problems in the best way possible. What do they learn given all the resources that come with that? What can we learn from that?
Well, and that's one of the really cool things now that I'm doing tech writing for Microsoft, right, is whenever I did docs writing at Puppet and for my own modules and stuff, it's like, what feedback do you get? You get nothing, right? Very rarely is any of the feedback doc specific. What metrics and sort of stuff do you get from us? That not a whole lot. Whereas like now I can see, like, if somebody's working through a course I did, how many people drop off from my course and never finish it, and what step did they quit on? Right. So now I can know if everybody gets to step 3 and then they start step 4 and they go, nah, and they quit. Like I did something wrong. I may not have specific information from those people about what about step 4 made them quit, but I know that step 4 is what's stopping them. So now I can go and I can rewrite that, try that, see what happens. And like having access to that kind of information, I think is really important for like how you do. And we do, we look at metrics on the rest of our doc set, right? It's like, how long do people spend looking at learning about classes, right? Is that documentation good? What's the bounce rate? Do people show up and go, nah, nope? And I think having access to that information is really useful, but I also think just like I get to work with hundreds of people now who have a really deep expertise in tech writing and in instructional design and stuff. And there's so much thought that goes into information architecture, which is something I'm learning from Sean, right? Because before this, it was like, I'd be like, well, what should I do to document this module? That's whatever I think is best, I guess. And now it's like, well, no, here are the things that we should cover. Here's how we should structure tutorials. And here's how a tutorial is different from a how-to. And there's all this stuff about information design that goes into it. And I'm finding a lot of that's actually cross-applicable with my RPG work, right? There's a similar problem there, which is like, how do you organize information for humans to consume, right? That's really what this fundamentally like boils down to. Yes, specifically for work, I'm doing it so you can learn technical concepts, but that applies to any information I want to give people basically ever, right? There are primitives here in how you structure stuff and how you organize content across pages and content sets, but also then specifically within a document, right? Like, does your first paragraph explain what they're going to learn? Does your first paragraph orient them effectively and give them a reason to learn the rest of the document? If it doesn't, rewrite it, right? Like, if I have to read 3/4 of a page to understand why I'm reading a page, I goofed, right? That's a mistake. So there's just a lot of stuff like that I've been picking up. And I think all kind of circles around instructional design, but also information architecture generally.
Fun stuff. I always like to highlight how patterns are repeated and like things you learn in a different domain can apply somewhere else. And it sounds like when it comes to delivering information, there's a lot of similar things in RPG work and when it comes to docs with Microsoft.
Yeah, I've found that to be the case. I had a talk prepped for the pitch for a doc prepped for a long time. So I did Dungeons and Dragons in development, which is more around what I call meta skills. Some people call soft skills, but I think that's kind of denigrating to that skill set. I think it implies that they're less valuable, which is not true. The other one that I wanted to do was around systems design and documentation between RPGs and technical projects, because there's a lot of overlap there in how game tools get used, because that's really what it is, right? Short detour into my game orthodoxy. Writers do not write games. They write tools which players at a table will use to make a game together, right? Because nobody implements it exactly the same, right? Everybody, I mean, like you could think of Monopoly as an example, right? And like how people use free parking. There are very, very few RPGs where people play exactly as written, every single rule. That cross table, that doesn't exist, right? Nobody does that outside of like organized play, and even then there's variation. The same is true of software, right? Nobody deploys the software exactly as the original developers envisioned it. There's always context in your environment that changes it. What do your security setups look like? How's your domain structured? There's so much stuff that goes into how tools end up in your environment and how they get used. So if you reorient yourself from like, this is the perfect thing that I made and everyone who touches it will be the same, to how do I ensure that I'm building stuff that can be effectively used for whatever they want, I think you end up with a better product, both in RPGs and in software. I think that's the more effective way to write those things, because it recognizes a truth.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially with software. You're never sure. But I'm always interested in how it's used in ways that's not intended, because there's certain times where that almost becomes like a feature. You can just do some minor tweaks and you can just add that as a selling point. But so collecting the data on how it's being used is always a kind of fascinating venture where I built it for X, but someone's not using it for that. And it just becomes like a self-selling and feature upgrade.
Yeah, if you reorient yourself to thinking of software as tools, right? When you are a tool-making company that makes hammers and chisels and stuff, do you have strong opinions about how the hammer gets used, what it is used for? No. You have strong opinions about how usable the hammer is, how effective the hammer is at, the specific task that hammer is made for, in the sense of like, I use a hammer to drive objects into other objects, right? It's a striking implement. And you can design more specific tools, right? There are hammers for different things, but, and in that way, you can have a little bit of something to say about like how the tool gets used. but you're still not deciding, are they building a birdhouse or a toy, like a dollhouse, or like what do they make? Like there's no way to predict or control that. So instead of trying, make your tool a good tool. That's a little reductive, but like make good tools that are resilient, ergonomic, and effective. And then you get to be delighted by what people make with your tools and what people accomplish with those tools. I think that's the important thing. And that's really what PowerShell shines at. PowerShell is a giant toolbox that also allows you to make your own tools out of the tools in the toolbox.
It's fun.
I like it.
Tool making tool.
Now, October's coming up.
Yep.
Are there any events going on during that month with Docs? Anything popping up?
Yes. So Sean and I, can you go outside, Gitava? 1 second.
I've been watching him get more restless as he was going.
You saw me turn off my camera. I just, might have done what the dog just did. I don't know.
That probably does not care about learning and improving at all. It's sad to see, but it's not for everybody.
Yeah, she's unconcerned with the human conversations. No, but so Hacktoberfest is coming up, and so Sean and I were talking about doing a sort of structured way to do Hacktoberfest for Docs contributions. So I'm setting up it's one of the things that I have to get done this week, so it's all ready for next week. There'll be a project on GitHub that'll have some meta issues associated, and we'll have a issue template. So what we're doing is collecting a lot of relatively simple changes and fixes, and like the sort of things like basically a quality update, right? Is the syntax correct? Are things cased the way that they should be? Are these lines too long? Should they be splatted? A lot of stuff like that. We're collecting into small issues so that you could say, well, I want to tackle casing for commandlets across these 3 files or whatever, right? Or I want to review this document for markdown lint or whatever. And then we'll have all that set up so that we can track who's working on what, and so you can see, so you don't like duplicate efforts, right? So if Andrew starts fixing all the syntax stuff in 3 files, and you start on it, Jordan, instead of being like, no, I did all this work to fix the files and Andrew already has a PR up, that kind of sucks. So we're putting some views in place to kind of help with that. And then we'll be doing updates and contributions on the Learn site to kind of show who's contributing and who's participating. And then I don't yet know exactly what cadence we're going to settle on. At least an hour a week, we will do synchronous availability of either or both myself and Sean, so that if you're trying to contribute, if you want to understand how to do like GitHub flow and like make things work, will be available like in a Teams meeting or whatever that y'all can join, where we'll walk you through it, we'll explain it and help you kind of like get up to speed. How do you clone the repo if you don't know how to do that? How do you make the changes? If you're not familiar with Markdown, we'll walk you through that. Not familiar with like doing a commit and pushing a PR, walk you through that. Just kind of all up a chance to kind of like take that dive and hone your skills on contributions.
We were mentioning opportunities and times to kind of confront your imposter syndrome and push yourself. And this sounds like a really awesome opportunity for people to start contributing to Docs if they haven't yet and learn some other ancillary skills.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that once you know how to do a little bit of Git and GitHub, anytime you want to contribute to another project or you want to get involved with something, you'll carry that with you because it's the same, right? Like they'll have some specific differences in terms of like, does this project need building or not? Like Docs doesn't, right? You can just edit a markdown file. As far as like friction to do the thing, it's about as low friction as you're going to get for GitHub. So I think that's like a good entry point. And the other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that these are real improvements. They're not like busy work. This is stuff that genuinely makes an impact on how readable and usable documentation is, right? And it helps people see what good practices look like. So I think that's really important. Is it's not like, hey, come do this stuff just so you have like, you know, a training exercise. It's like make a real improvement and learn something for yourself along the way. Give back to the community and get something out of it.
Also an opportunity to get like feedback from the people that do the writing. I mean, if you're the type to just kind of sit back, it's like, well, I would have done this different, so this is done. It's a good chance for you to also explain to Mikey and Sean why you know so much more than they do about best practice.
There are times where I'm wrong, right? I'm not always the expert. I know a little about a lot, and I know a lot about a little. But that leaves a large gap perpetually. I think that's true for everybody, right? I haven't owned infrastructure in more than 5 years, going on 6 or 7 now, right? So what are best practices around like doing IIS? Don't know. I couldn't tell you. If you put me in charge of an IIS pool today, I would hose that thing within hours. Be like, all of our traffic stopped and we don't know why. It's like the only person who logged in was Mike. What happened? I'm like, oh, I was just testing something. Oh, well, prod's down now. So if you could untest it, that would be sweet.
I do all my testing in prod.
Well, that's, all testing eventually happens in prod. It's just whether or not you put tests in front of those tests that, kind of matters.
Awesome.
You've mentioned a couple times that you write RPGs. Is that like you build out stories around campaigns that people can join in, or what? I guess what goes into that?
Yeah, I guess where I'm mostly situated is around really 3 pieces of RPG writing. The first is that I'm a heretic and I do write systems, even though they don't really matter. Because again, people will use or not use whatever pieces. And if you've played other games, you probably pull pieces of those in with you to other games that you play, right? You can't forget all your experiences. That's not how humans work. So that's probably the least interesting writing I do. Except I will say I wrote a pretty cool war game called Flagrant Factions, which I've been investing a lot of time and effort into, and I'm having a lot of fun with that. That is currently in layout for digital offline release. The whole thing is up on my co-op website, but the digital offline will be up on LeanPub sooner or later, and that'll be EPUB and print at home PDF. And then we're going to do a physical edition, probably a boxed set, because I'm out of my mind. So I do some systems, and then I do a little bit of like setting work, which is, for me, settings and adventures are pretty close to the same thing because of the way that I write. I don't like writing stories for other people. I like writing situations and places and filling them with interesting people and things and events that are kind of like, kicking off or whatever. I like giving you a powder keg, right? Just add players, i.e. matches, and have an explosion, i.e. fun.
So with doing something like that, does that mean it's kind of it's not tied directly to D&D, but no matter what tabletop you play, I could just maybe with some adjustments based on the differences, but any system could use the settings, or is it tied to?
Yeah, that tends to be how I write. So I might assume something of like a particular milieu, or a lot of my stuff is what we'll refer to sometimes as like system agnostic D&D compatible or BX compatible, which is basic expert. It's an old version of D&D. What it really comes down to for me from a design perspective is like, if you think about a faction of goblins, what's the hard part about a faction of goblins? Is it how many hit points they have? No, you can make that up. Just, okay, goblins have 1d6, except the boss has 3d6 hit points, whatever. Is it how much damage they deal? No, that's not hard. Is it how fast they move? No, it's not the stats. It's none of the mechanical representations. The interesting thing, the thing that takes you more time to come up with on the fly when you're playing, is what do these goblins want? Why are they here? What are they into? Right. So if I say, if I give you all the stats for goblins and then I don't tell you any of that, I haven't really given you anything. It's like I gave you no more useful information than if I just said there's goblins, right? Which you could do. So the way that I approach it is example faction off the top of the dome. So there is this little village down in the dungeon. The buildings are made of like stone and animal skin and a lot of fungus. They've been growing and shaping the fungus to like form like roofs and doors and stuff. And the village is about 30 to 40 goblins. There's not a whole lot. And they're all a little emaciated. They seem hungry and pretty nervous. They've got kind of this feeling of like they're a little paranoid, right? And then they tend to be armed with stone tools for the most part. They have some clubs with rocks at the end, except for the shaman and a short but beefy little goblin, much shorter than the other ones, who carries a copper koppesh, which is a sort of curved blade. I'll drop a link to a picture so that you can kind of like get what they look like. Okay, kopeshes are pretty cool. And that is what should we call them? Squat is the little one, because I'm not super inventive with names. And then the shaman is tall and very thin, with long blue hair, and carries a scepter tipped with a piece of amber, inside of which is a dragonfly, right? And then maybe the shaman knows a couple of spells. So like that's kind of like how I would start like doing that part of the design, because that gives you a lot to work with, even if I don't elaborate on like why are the goblins paranoid, right? Like what do they have going on? That's something for you to build off of as a referee. Of course, if I was actually writing it down, I would say, there's a troll in the dungeon that's been ambushing the goblins, and so like they're pretty worried about that or whatever.
So it seems if you're interested in DMing, which I don't know why it would be, that sounds horrible. But
it's a lot of fun.
You build like guideposts to help them along, and then just so they can kind of build up their skill set that way, so they can start building their own campaigns then.
Yeah, a lot of the design that I do assumes one of two things. One, you're a referee without a lot of time and you just want something to run tonight. And so I lay down the stuff that you could use to run a game tonight, right? Or two, you're running your own campaign and you want some filler stuff. So there's, you wrote on your map, dungeon in the mountain, and that's all the prep you've done. What if you could just take this dungeon and slap it in, right? Wouldn't that be nice? So stuff like that. So again, going back to that earlier perspective, I don't have opinions about how you use the tools I write. I don't care very much. For me, it's more, can I write something interesting that compels you to want to use my tool, right? And if it's not compelling or it's not interesting or you think it sucks, okay, fair enough, right? No harm, no foul. So yeah, I think that's a lot of what I write is systems, which are tools for eliding gameplay stuff that I think is boring, without getting too much into theory. Rules are for things that you don't want to role play through, right? Or would be maybe a lot of work to role play through, like picking a lock. You could describe how you wiggle the pick to like turn each tumbler, and like you can go through all that for every type of lock that could be in the game. Or you could just say roll a d20 on a 15 up, you pick that lock, right? And then if you don't want to do the role play through it, then you have a thing. So it elides those things, right? It's for me, mechanisms deal with the boring diegetic parts of the world, whereas all the interesting stuff is the people and the things and like what's actually happening. So sorry, I have to cut myself off there or I will go forever.
No, that's awesome. We'll make sure to include some links in the show notes for people who are interested in checking out some more RPG stuff.
Sure.
Now, Jordan, Do we have some questions that we need to ask? Oh wait, no, we want to talk about the Dsc Docs. What's been going on with those? Any changes?
Oh, yes. There are V2 docs now, and there weren't before.
Hey.
So really, really quickly, there are 3 versions of DSC out right now. V11 is the one that you're probably very familiar with, shipped in PowerShell 5.1. It's got the LCM, and you can do invoke DSC resource, or you can do start DSC configuration, those kinds of things. Then there is V2, where there is no start DSC configuration. The only way to directly use DSC resources in V2, currently stable is V2.05, is with invoke DSC resource, or if you're using Azure Policy's machine configuration feature, you can write a config, compile the config, and then use Azure Policy to kind of apply that. Under the hood, it's using invoke DSC resource, but that allows you to still kind of like arrange things with the configuration DSL, as you're familiar. And then there's V3, which is a preview state. I think it's I can't remember what the version increment is now. I should have looked that up beforehand. So that's not set in stone yet because it's not set to stable. But V3 completely rips out the LCM and all those things. So you can still do the configuration keyword in current V3, and again, only really works with machine configuration, or if you write your own thing to kind of go over the compiled config and do whatever. And then there's invoke DSC resource. The big difference between V2 and V3 from your perspective is that MOF-based resources, that is resources that have a MOF to define their schema, are gone. Those will not work in V3 forward. That has been dropped for a lot of reasons, not least of which is that it is really, really hard to try and do cross-platform. It involves a lot of like OMI and some instance stuff, and it's terrible. So instead, the way forward there currently is to do class-based DSC resources. If you're writing a DSC resource today, if it didn't exist and you're making one new, write a class-based DSC resource. That's kind of like the big takeaway. So back to the docs for a second. Prior to about a month and a half ago, the only docs in V2 was an overview that said, this is the V2 docs. And then there was nothing else, right? There was no information. So what I did over the last couple of weeks was I took all the docs in V11. I took what was applicable. I reorganized, rewrote, and retooled a lot of it, and then made it specific for the use case of DSC V2. If you're using invoke DSC resource and V2, great. But the intended, the supported use case, the one that is what you should be using it for, is if you are doing Azure Policies machine configuration feature on Windows machines, you want to use the V2 docs to kind of like guide you to where to go, because there are some differences in how you write configurations, and there are some differences in like what you can and should expect, what'll work. So the docs in V2 are tooled specifically, especially the configuration docs, the stuff that talks about the DSL and how to do configs, tooled specifically around machine configuration. All the invoke DSC resource stuff is pretty normal across them. Like how to write a resource doesn't really change, but that in particular is there. And so the other thing that I started doing, the net new documentation, falls along 2 lines. One, I finally went and documented the PSDSC resources module, where all the documentation lived in the README on GitHub, and that was it. So there's full documentation for that now, broken out with example code for using those resources both in a configuration and with invoke DSC resource, which that didn't exist before, and just kind of a nicer, easier to read layout for those things. And then the second is I've been working on class-based DSC resource documentation specifically. I wrote a concept doc for that, and I'm working through a tutorial now. So all that stuff is getting better. That's kind of like where my focus is on writing docs right now, is on class-based DSC resources and on DSC V2. in prep for, I figure if I solve all these problems in V2, then I can just copy most of my work over to V3. And I'll just delete stuff that doesn't apply anymore. Like I won't need docs on MOF-based DSC resources because they won't exist. So
Sounds like a massive undertaking, man. Congrats.
it's a lot of work.
It'll take like a day or two,
Yeah.
or
Yeah, like 5 or 6 hours total, start to finish.
Just a coffee and yeah.
Yeah, there's no problem.
well, off of that great group work, the next part's going to seem pretty simple for you, and that is we're calling it consistent questions.
Yeah, such a creative title.
We need to name it. We'll name it at some point. All right. So, what is one time something went wrong while on the job, and how did you handle it, and what did you learn from it?
Well, here's a really good one. I love telling this story. There's two, but I think the more interesting one for later on, because everybody's blown up their own prod before, right? So TLDR on that is I once accidentally started the reboot script for patching, but against live prod and not alt prod. Thankfully, the first server to go down was the controller. So I saw it and I was like, does that say prod? And then the whole server went down. I was like, well, that's good. I'm glad that it rebooted itself first and didn't get to the others, because live rebooting Oracle databases in the middle of transactions, bad time. Don't do that. But everybody's done something similar, right? Maybe not as boneheaded, but similar. So the interesting one is when I was at Puppet, I was working on the Puppet SQL Server module, which largely controls installing and configuring SQL Server. So I get a ticket from a very nice user over in Slack who talked to me and then was like, here's what I'm seeing, and I filed this ticket, yada, yada. I was like, okay, cool. So the problem is that sometimes our module would cause a intermittent uninstall and reinstall of SQL Server. And so I tracked it down. I figured out what the problem was, and I pushed a fix, and I did a release. And I was like, hey, go ahead and give this a shot. Let me know how it goes. He comes back and says, I have good news and I have bad news. I said, okay, what's up? I said, well, it no longer intermittently uninstalls and reinstalls SQL Server. I was like, well, that's great. That's the problem then. And he's like, well, no. So now it uninstalls and reinstalls on every run. I said, well, that sounds like a different bug. No. So the thing that I learned from that was like doing more thorough testing, right? Because I tested what happens when I do the install and I do one more check, but my environment didn't look like his, right? It wasn't the same as like the prod environment. And the big thing with that was like, when you're working through problems, keep close contact with the person that you're solving it for. And instead of cutting a release, what I should have done was like, hey, here's the branch with that fixed code. Can you try that on a test machine for me? And then he could have tried it out in the same circumstances where the bug was originally being generated, and we could have iterated more quickly from there, right? And then a little bit of that was just like being a little bit more humble. That was about the time that I felt like I was getting the hang of things. And so no quicker way to remind yourself that, no, you're still learning than to set things on fire. Luckily, he was trying it in his test environment and not in prod. So I did not accidentally set fire to his entire domain, but I sure could have if I hadn't been more careful, or if he hadn't been more careful. I wasn't careful. That's how that happened in the first place.
Wow. That's a good thing to learn from it, though. That's a nice takeaway. Instead of just accepting defeat, learn something, do it better next time.
Yep.
All right. Question 2. They get more and more difficult. All right. This is serious business. With your knowledge now, what's one tip you'd give your younger self when first starting in IT?
Oh, good question, Jordan.
Yeah,
I like that.
Great question. That's just off the top of my head.
Top of the dome. Good. I can only tell past me one thing. What would I say? It's a good question. There's a lot of things that I would say, but I think the biggest one is not even really technical, but is just be kinder to yourself. Have more grace for yourself at the start, because some of that is wrapped up a little bit with ADHD, and some of that is just wrapped up in, I think, something that everybody universally can accept, which is early on in your career, you're going to fail a lot, and you're going to feel really bad, and you're going to feel stupid. And so I think you should have the grace for yourself to know that you're learning and growing. And it's not because you're stupid or lazy or incompetent or any of those things. There's no inherent character flaw within you that is causing you to make these mistakes. It's not because you're not paying enough attention. It's not because you don't care enough. It's because you're learning something new. You're in a new space. You are growing, and you need to give yourself not just the space to grow, but you need to give yourself the grace to grow without beating yourself up, right? Because that's not going to help you. If anything, that's going to slow you down, because you'll spend more time mad at yourself than you will learning. And the goal at that point, early in that stage of your career, is to learn and to get better. And just, yeah, I mean, that would be probably like the thing, because I was 21 when I really got into tech. So I would go back to 21-year-old me and be like, hey, be nicer to yourself. You're going to suck for a long time, but you're going to get better. And you don't need to beat yourself up, because everybody goes through this.
It's great advice. If you're going to, at work, we strive to be nice to our coworkers and a kind person. We should definitely reflect that to ourselves, because for the same reasons it makes sense to interact with our coworkers in a respectful way so they can take what we say and do something with it. It's important to do that with ourselves as well. But it's a struggle, because I think most people aren't just having that when they start their careers. Maybe some are, but
yeah, and I think it's easy to externalize that you should be nice to other people when they make mistakes, because one of the things that I remind myself all the time is I don't know what's going on in your head, right? I don't know why you made the decisions you did, but I know when I make decisions based on the context that I'm in, and I do the best that I can, right? And I like to believe that nobody shows up to work trying to break everything, right? So if something gets broken or goes wrong, I don't think it's because they don't care or they didn't try. I think it's because there was a mismatch between what they believed and what was true. And that can happen to anybody at any time. But when you're looking at yourself, it's easy because you know all the context that went into your decisions. Like, well, I should have known X, right? So one of the things that I talk about when I'm mentoring people is not to bog yourself down with counterfactuals, right? If you find yourself reviewing an event or critiquing yourself or anyone else, and you start introducing, well, what if reality was different? Okay, but it wasn't. Right? That's not useful. And it's like, well, what if everything was magical and just worked perfectly? Oh, that'd be neat, but it's not. So why go down that road? It would be super cool. I would be so much faster if I just did everything right the first time perfectly. But counterfactuals don't help you. They're a distraction from learning and growing. So instead of beating yourself up about counterfactuals, and it's, again, because you're on the inside, you know all the information you had, you know you missed something. Instead of saying, well, I'm such an idiot for missing that, like, well, I know for next time to check that, right? I know for next time to like treat that as more important than I did this time. I didn't realize how important it was then. I do now. So I just don't make the same mistake again. Much more effective way to treat it.
I've noticed no one has yet to give their past self stock tips.
Ooh.
Oh, I had no
your
money.
Head's at, man.
I had no money. That would not have helped. It'd have been like, invest in, go back to, 2008. Invest in Amazon stock. It's going to blow up. You're going to get it. Get in on Microsoft and be like, okay, I have $40 to my name and 30 of that has to go to gas and food. Like, well,
yeah,
for
but that $10 would now be worth like $35.
Yeah, it'd be pretty good. But yeah, it's just, I think the other thing about giving yourself specific advice that relates to like either tech or finance or whatever, I think better advice for yourself might be like, hey, idiot, keep a budget, right? Like stop ending up with $30 in your account every month.
Well, now that I'm feeling attacked, I'm going to go to the third question.
To be clear, I ended up that way all the time, even in my 30s. It's fine.
This one's a big one, and there is a wrong answer.
Got it.
What are your 3 favorite modules?
My 3 favorite modules. I can't list my own, right?
Of course you can.
I don't really maintain anymore. Well, we're working on some new ones that will be landing in the near future. But, nothing really to say about those yet because they don't exist. 3 favorite modules. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and say the ones that I found most useful because I don't really have favorites anymore. Using either of the YAML ones is great because you probably have to consume YAML at some point, and being able to convert back and forth is pretty good. And you could write JSON, but I hate authoring in JSON, so I guess PowerShell-YAML is a pretty good one. Okay, I do have one that I don't use that I think is rad, which is the PowerShell Universal Dashboard. That is some of the coolest stuff. And every time I want to have an excuse to use it, I remember that I don't want to own infrastructure, and so then I don't use it. But I think about it a lot. I think about like a lot of cool things you could do with it, like running a user group site off of it, that kind of thing. Super, super cool. If you haven't ever checked it out, definitely do. 3rd module. This is tough because I mostly just document core stuff. It's PowerShell, or Microsoft.PowerShell.core. It's a pretty good module. I don't know if you heard of it.
I use it.
Yeah, I've used it a couple times. It comes up occasionally. Trying to think of another one that's on the gallery without cracking open the gallery right now and just looping through to find one.
You ever used PowerShell? You mess with that? You mentioned Brandon Olin.
I did actually. I was poking at it back when I was at Puppet to write a Slack bot for us. Which ended up not being possible because the API for Puppet is, well, I don't work for them anymore. It's not good. It's not super scriptable. There's a lot of problems there that I didn't like. Yeah, Poshbot's a really good one. I'm trying to think of one that you don't just feed to me though. Come on, think. I never used it, but every single time I told any of my data people about it, they would come back to me later, stars in their eyes, like, I don't know how I was doing this before. It's DBA tools. If you're dealing with SQL Server and you're not using DBA tools, stop it. Switch.
First of all, congrats, because it is such a, wow, you have an opportunity to do some things a lot easier and a lot better if you are not currently using it. So huge opportunity. Congrats.
So yeah, when you recommend DBA tools, just start with, I'm not going to charge you, but I would like to think about how much time you saved after you started using this and pay me for your time.
Yeah.
And see how much money you can accrue.
Yeah, I should hit up Chrissy and be like, hey, can I get a commission? We're like, oh, for my free product? Yeah, no. Probably you can get 30% of 0. I'm doing great.
All right. Well, I have to ask you, Mikey, have you ever seen the show Ozark? All right, that's perfect, because the premise of this.
I realize I should answer. We're on a podcast, and shaking my head doesn't come across in audio.
The premise is a guy who basically can talk himself out of trouble to such an unrealistic level that superhero movies would blush at the idea of adding it to them, just because it's so unrealistic what he can talk himself out of.
So he's Italian.
Or so I thought, until I started working with Andrew Pla. And I got to tell you, not only is Ozark within the realm of possibility, I think they're underselling what you can do with words. And we have the distinct pleasure of just dealing with the paragon of speech as he takes us along for the shill of the ride. Take it away, Andrew.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends. We're here to shill. Thank you so much for listening. We've been on quite a wild ride. We've covered a lot of fantastic stuff, as we always do, in my opinion. In my opinion, #1 PowerShell podcast. If you've listened this far, had a good time, like us on YouTube, say what's up. Give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, or your podcast platform of choice, and recommend it to a friend. You have coworkers who maybe are somewhere early on in their PowerShell journey. Send them your favorite episode, get them hooked. And if you have some feedback, questions, whatever, you can email us at PowerShell@pdq.com, or you can just tweet us at PowerShellPod. We love hearing from our amazing listeners.
So good.
It's got like a good tone to it too. Like there's like a lot of richness in the voice.
It's a master class of shilling. It's we're all privileged to be able to listen.
That's what it is. Yeah. Real masterclass. I should go into like late night infomercial. That's where I'm going next.
That's where you got to go. Get on QVC.
I do have some concerns that I've started going so extreme with my intro. Like, where do I go from here? Like, it took me a long time to come up with the Ozark tie-in.
No, you'll get there. You can just keep escalating forever. That's not a problem.
We'll see.
I want there to be some like epic background music or some kind of thing as I'm going, to really build the mood of like, wow, this is a moment that we're experiencing here together.
No, you just got to get the editor to do that. Just continually, you got to start and then just keep building up. And then if you make the music more epic each episode, that'll really sell it.
We're just going to keep
some things out there.
And we're going to have the most highly produced shill.
There you go.
Out there.
Double my voice. Make me sound like the I don't remember what it was. The Wizard of Oz. That booming voice. Yeah, that'd be great.
Just gotta slowly add more Andrews in reverb. Yeah. So like by the 17th episode of that, it's just a chorus of Andrews.
It's angelic choir. Well, awesome.
Oh, that's what you should add in the background.
Ooh.
Well, we appreciate your time. I thought this was a very fun episode. I'm actually going to look up some of your campaign settings and send them to my DM. See if he takes it personal or if he just if they start showing up.
I have. If you ever want, just hit me up. I run with a pretty good crew of people who write way better settings than I do. Nate Tremai's stuff is great. Bats' stuff is great. Everything Micah does is great. It's yet again. It's kind of like a running theme here. Is like surround yourself with people who kick more ass than you, and you'll get better too. So super lucky to be able to do that continuously throughout my career and my side gigs.
Power leveling, right?
Yeah, that is absolutely an excellent line. I can't imagine a better way. That was perfect.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast with your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plough.
You don't want to be messing with them guys. They are bad news.
The PowerShell Podcast is a production of PDQ.com.